Welcome to the Nate Wenke Podcast, episode 5. And the topic for today is going to be Chat GPT. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard of this by now. It has frankly exploded across the internet for good reasons. And I want to get into those good reasons and the implications of this AI, but more broadly, I want to talk about AI in general and what exactly is coming down the pipeline here. Because all of you should be aware of this. And whether you get that information from me or somewhere else is completely irrelevant. There are questions that we need to answer. There are discussions that we need to have about the implications of these systems, how they should be used, how exactly we ensure that their motives and their objectives align with ours. There are a lot of questions. So I want to get into those questions. And my goal today is not to have some master plan of what exactly we should do, because I don't have it. And most of these questions, I barely can scratch the surface on how exactly we're going to tackle. But we need to have this discussion, and we need to have it yesterday. So I'm hoping that this will be informative and will get people realizing what exactly is coming down the pipeline here. Because this is game changing. This could be printing press Gutenberg game changing level stuff here. So let's jump into it with that as the intro, shall we? So what is ChatGPT? This AI software came out, I believe it was November 30, from OpenAI, and it is a model based upon Chat GPT 3, which was essentially a weaker, less sophisticated version than what we're experiencing now. And what it stands for is Chat Generative Pre-trained Transformer. And it uses language modeling to generate its responses. And basically how this works is it was fed a massive amount of text and data, I believe from a period before 2021. Essentially, it doesn't have access to the internet, but it has access to basically anything before 2021. I could have that timeline slightly off, but regardless, basically all of history, all of human text, it has access to. And how this works is it processes that insanely large amount of data and then tries to extract patterns out of it, and then works to refine its methods by trying to predict the next logical sequence of words or phrases in a sentence, and then essentially it's graded on how well its response lines up with human speech patterns, both by comparing it to the large data set that it has, and then also through human training. Basically, correct answers / better answers are given higher grades. It integrates that into the algorithm and then continues to improve. So this is both a self-improvement process, but also a process guided by humans trying to help it improve. And there's some background information on AI in general that's really relevant here, because this system's called an AGI, or artificial general intelligence, and it isn't in some sense a full version of that, but it's certainly one of the closest things I've heard about in terms of what that means. But most of us are familiar with something called narrow AI. And there's a key distinction here. So I want to kind of highlight that to understand why this is so transformative. So, for example, your calculator is an example of narrow AI. We have math tools, we have computers, we have systems that are already smarter than you in many different dimensions, but the key is that they're narrow dimensions. They're singular. They're not multifaceted. Basically, these narrow AI systems, they can do specific tasks such as language translation, image recognition, or even playing games, but they're not able to reason, plan, solve problems, understand complex concepts, or learn new things in a way that a human would do. Whereas AGI, otherwise known as strong AI, it's a system that can perform any intellectual task that a human can. And the goal of general AI research is to create systems that can think and learn like humans and have the ability to adapt to new tasks and situations. And that is what we're dealing with here with Chat GPT. And there's a massive distinction between this narrow AI concept and AGI, which is what we're experiencing right now. So that's kind of a key distinction here between the different AI models and what exactly most of the research is focused on. Because AGI is kind of the holy grail in some sense. Having the smartest AGI is by far the biggest goal of most of these companies. And it's because, as I outlined before, it's able to actually act like a human could in terms of its thinking ability. And its ability to adapt and self-improve is the key here. And that will continue to take off. Another key distinction here I want to talk about is processing speeds. So one of the key distinctions between AI and humans is the speed at which we can process information, draw conclusions, and test those conclusions. So a common misconception is that we would actually need an AGI system smarter than us to make some kind of serious difference. And that theory just gets demolished the second that you understand how electronic circuits process information and how neural networks process information. And the biggest difference is simply in speed. Your neural connections might operate on the order of 200 to 1,000 operations per second, versus an AI can be in the order of billions of operations per second. So electronic circuits are just simply faster. And the reason that this is so important is because time is money, essentially. And coming to a conclusion first, this first mover advantage, is massive here. And I'll explain more about what I mean by first mover advantage here pretty soon. But I want to do a thought experiment that I heard from Sam Harris. He's a famous atheist, neuroscientist, podcaster, brilliant guy. And he was having a discussion on AI and had an interesting thought experiment that I think is really relevant here. So let's do that, shall we? So imagine that you have 100 people in a room with average IQ, and they're tasked with solving a problem. They have 24 hours to solve that problem. And then imagine in the room next door, you have 100 AGI systems with roughly the same IQ. In fact, you could make them dumber, but for the sake of argument, let's say that they're the same IQ. Basically, the room that has the humans in it has about 24 hours to solve this problem. The room that has the AGI systems has about 2,700 years to solve the problem, simply because of the speed at which they process information. And this difference is so massive that even if you developed an AI system that just wasn't that smart, your average high schooler, simply by giving them the ability to process information at speeds that we can't even imagine, already puts them ahead. And this is a key distinction here. So even if we have humans that are technically smarter from an IQ and intelligence perspective, it's not clear, in fact, we know, that even an AGI system that can't compete with them from a time perspective, the AGI wins every single time. So let's get back into what Chat GPT can actually do and what it can't do, because this could be quite useful. So it primarily deals with human language. Again, massive amounts of human language data, written text and audio data converted to text that it can process and derive patterns from that information to try to model human speech as best as possible. What it can't do is what we can do. And what I mean by that is it's not able to process real-world data. It doesn't have access to the internet. It doesn't have the ability to see reality in some sense. That will change here very soon. It will not be long until it does have the ability to process real-world data and the ability to model human behavior and action in the real world. And the reason that this is such a massive distinction here is because the ability to actually test hypotheses, linguistic hypotheses, in quote-unquote the real world, even if that is a simulation of the real world, is in some sense the holy grail here, because that is exactly what scientists do. They take a linguistic, hypothetical solution or hypothesis to a given problem, and they go test that in the real world with human action. Imagine that you have an AI system that can do that. Well, it will be able to do it massively faster, and its ability to then truly self-improve is astronomically greater. So this is a key distinction here between access to real-world data and the ability to act like a human can in terms of adaptation and reacting to how the world reacts in terms of how well a given hypothesis did in the world. This is huge. And this is coming. It will not be long until an AI system has access to the internet. It will not be long until they're able to accurately model the world. So, this brings us to an interesting question. We have some information about how these systems work. We have some information about the revolutionary nature of AGI versus narrow AI. And part of me is super excited about this. I mean, this is going to change the world in largely a good way, at least initially. But it's not clear where this goes. It's not clear where this ends. And back to Sam Harris, he made this exact point, and I totally agree with him. Intelligence is our chief resource. It's what we want more of. And yet, runaway intelligence, intelligence beyond our capability to understand or control, could also be what destroys us. So it's that which we most want, but also that which is most dangerous to us. And this is the tricky ethical, moral, practical dilemma that we currently find ourselves in. How exactly do we adapt to the systems that can change the world for the better, and yet also could potentially radically change the way in which we interact with the world and ultimately destroy us? So that brings us to where exactly we could go with some of this technology. And one of the claims that Brett Weinstein made, and he's an evolutionary biologist, he just went on Joe Rogan. Highly recommend the podcast. Very good podcast. Most of it actually was about COVID, but they talked a decent amount about Chat GPT and the implications of it. And one of Brett's primary concerns was this issue of novelty and genuine creative achievement is going to be difficult to detect, because every high schooler can write any essay on any prompt right now. It can be a damn good essay. What do you do with that? How exactly do you verify the fact that whatever that person wrote, or whatever tweet that person sent, or whatever article was written, was a novel, creative achievement generated by them and not from an AI system? What's going to happen to a certain extent is you're going to have AI systems that are detected, or that are designed to detect the other AI systems that generated the thing in the first place. And this applies to language, this applies to video, this applies to audio, and this brings us into a discussion of deepfakes. And deepfakes essentially are AI-generated audio or video that is indistinguishable from real-world audio or video. Essentially, an AI system can get so powerful that it can generate a video that we won't be able to recognize as generated by an AI system. The only way that we can recognize it is with another AI system telling us if it's actually genuine or not. Now, this raises all sorts of interesting implications. Right now, from a justice perspective, our court systems use audio and video evidence as reality. In some cases, they are the biggest source of evidence that you can bring before a jury or a judge. Body cameras on police officers. This has massively shaped the way that we look at justice in court proceedings. What happens when you can type into an AI algorithm, I want you to make a video about this person doing this or saying this, and we aren't able to distinguish between whether that event actually happened or whether it was generated from an AI. Now, that in some cases is worst case scenario. You can imagine a much simpler scenario where you simply put out a given video, a hit piece, let's say. You want the president to say something racist, or you want someone that you hate to say something despicable, and you put that out there on the internet. What do you think the probability is that most people are going to look at that and think, maybe that was generated by an AI. Maybe I shouldn't react flippantly and with aggression and assume things. Well, if you've ever been on the internet, ever, you'll know that that never happens. People never react with nuance and a detailed analysis of what's going on. Always, the reaction is full of anger, derision, assumptions, and you see this happen all the time in the news cycle where someone said something or a story comes out, and then it turns out later on that the evidence simply doesn't support what happened, or there's much more to the story because things are complex. So even if we are able to verify whether or not a video or audio piece was in fact within the real world, the time it could take to actually verify it could be too late in some serious sense. The damage could have already been done to a large extent. And this will become a new reality. There's no doubt about this. Deepfakes are here. In fact, I heard about an AI system. It wasn't Chat GPT, but it was a similar system that you could ask it to essentially create a movie. So create the characters, create the entire plot, and create the movie. And it could do it. And we couldn't distinguish between whether or not the movie had genuinely been acted out by real people or whether an AI had done it. So this raises all sorts of different implications. In fact, I heard another story where different people created OnlyFans accounts with AI-generated pictures and then asked the AI to interact with the people that were paying for the subscription to the OnlyFans account. And they made a bunch of money. What do you do with that? So we're going to see more and more of this. And it's going to continue to saturate our internet experience more and more. What do you do when what previously may have lacked nuance, may have lacked complexity, may be a snippet of a larger conversation, but you knew that it was real to a certain extent. There was a certainty in at least it wasn't faked. For the most part. And now we enter into a framework where that no longer is the case. Truth as we know it, reality as we know it, as we see it online, will be questionable. So this is a massive problem. And again, what's going to happen is you're going to have AI systems that are designed to detect the deep fakes, and you're going to have other AI systems that are designed to evade the detection of the other AI. It's a war of AI because we won't be able to tell. So this raises a bunch of questions. Some of the more common questions that a lot of people have about systems like this within the ethical dimension are things as simple as self-driving cars. You end up in scenarios all the time where you have to make, well, frankly, thousands of ethical decisions as you drive. And you don't realize it, of course, but you have to make all sorts of different decisions. And then there are scenarios, rare, true, but they will occur, where you have to make an ethical choice between two very serious different outcomes. And for the sake of argument, let's assume you either have to hit grandma or you have to hit a kid. There's no way around this. One or the other is going to happen. And you can imagine scenarios like this. Well, what do you program the AI to do? What exactly do you tell it to do? And then how does that hold up in court? And then who's responsible? Is it the driver? Or is it the AI? Is it the company that manufactured the AI? What do you do with this? And right now, those questions are being asked. And again, back to one of the first dilemmas that I talked about was we want more intelligence. It happens to be the case that tens of thousands of people die in traffic accidents every year, and hundreds of thousands of more are injured. Billions of dollars are lost because of human error. We can get rid of that, effectively speaking. I mean, the key will be introducing not just one self-driving car, not just 50% of the cars being self-driving, but all of them. And they'll be essentially act as a hive mind is the mentality here, is that they'll be able to communicate with each other. Travel times will dramatically decrease because all of the AI systems will know exactly where they're going, so they can communicate to be the most efficient. Traffic will effectively disappear as we know it. Traffic accidents will effectively disappear as we know it. So these are incredible things. We want more of this. And yet, how do you program morality and ethical decision-making into an AI? So we have some serious questions here. Another branch of this discussion is autonomous weapons. Right now, to my knowledge, the U.S. military does not allow AI to make the final decision about a kill order. At the end of the day, a human still decides who lives or dies. There will come a time where that may not be the case anymore. And there's certainly going to be times where it makes more sense to allow the AI to make the decision due to a strategic reason or due to a time factor than it does to have some kind of human oversight. What do? Do you allow the AI to make that decision? Or do you prevent it, even if it means that you end up losing a war? So there are some serious ethical concerns about what level of control we give it, and what the implications are for that as well. Another problem that I wanted to talk about was this alignment problem. And the basic idea here is simply, what if our goals don't perfectly overlap? What if it's the case that we give it an objective, but in the objective that we've given it, it decides to go a route that we couldn't have predicted? And for the sake of argument, for the sake of illustrating this point, I'll use a rather extreme example. But imagine that you tell an AI system, your primary goal is to end human suffering. Well, one way to end human suffering is to kill all the humans. Now, that seems like a fairly simple problem to stop, and fair enough. But you can imagine more complex versions of this particular problem, where we give it an objective, but we don't specify exactly what it can and cannot do. And through trying to achieve that objective, it ends up doing something that we don't want it to do. And this is basically this idea behind this alignment problem. What happens if our goals don't align? And even if it's within our complete control, we've ensured that it doesn't have a consciousness, it's not making decisions on its own, but nonetheless, it decides to go about solving a problem in the way that we couldn't imagine, that has externalities, that has negative consequences that we couldn't imagine. We end up into a scenario where, in some sense, it's out of control. And with a system that is designed such that it's improving upon itself in ways that we can't even fully understand, because we're there at this point. There's algorithms, there's AI systems out there that we're not smart enough to improve them, so they have to improve themselves. They have to edit their own source code to improve themselves. How exactly do you keep control of something that you don't even understand? So these are serious questions that we all have to ask. And I wanted to bring it back to this first mover discussion. And this is something that Elon Musk is particularly concerned about, which is this idea that he essentially believes that whoever comes up with the best AGI system first will rule the world, more or less, because he believes in this first mover advantage. Again, time being this extremely important factor here, that the explosion of intelligence and power that will come from having the first well-working AGI system will be too big to surmount from other people within the sphere. And then you have to ask the question, okay, is it easier to make safe AI or easier to just make AI? And what I mean by this is that it seems reasonable to suggest that making the most well-functioning, capable, competent AI first will be easier if you're not trying to program in morality, if you're not trying to program in all of the potential consequences of the alignment problem that I talked about. In other words, what if it's the case that it's a hell of a lot easier to make an AI system quickly that might not be safe versus a safe system? Well, that seems fairly reasonable. So what do you do if China's working on the exact same system that you're working on? Because they are right now. What do you do if they come out with an AI first? Because again, if Elon Musk is correct and there is this first mover advantage, it's kind of winner take all here. Whoever gets there first wins. And I don't know if I completely agree with this argument. It's simply an interesting thought experiment for the sake of talking about how exactly we're going to design these things and what incentive structures are pushing in different directions. And beyond morality, there's other questions about what if we program in bias? And even right now, Chat GPT is biased. There's no doubt about it. It claims to not be, and it's wrong. The programmers did, in fact, program in specifically political bias. I saw a number of articles on this, and frankly, it's disturbing. And I don't know if we will ever be able to fully recover from the path that they've set us down on here. But you can ask it very specific political questions, and it will only give answers in a certain direction. I saw one interesting post that asked ChatGPT to write a poem on the virtues of Donald Trump. And it refused to do it, hypothetically because it wanted to remain apolitical. But then if you asked it to write a poem about the virtues of President Joe Biden, it was perfectly happy to do it. Another interesting example of this was I saw one user try to ask it to write a poem on the virtues of a individual race. So they did Latino people, They did African Americans. They did Asians. And it was happy to write a virtuous poem about all of those races. And then they tried to do white people, and it couldn't do it because that would be not politically correct. So what do we do when our AI systems are biased in a particular political direction? That seems like a bad idea. And yet that's happening right now with this very system. How do we ensure, when we ourselves have such vehement disagreements about political subjects, about morality, about ethics, how do we ensure that whatever system we design is truly a neutral, moral actor when we can't even decide upon these things ourselves? So that is one of the larger concerns about this system. And then we get into some more interesting questions about, back to the initial broad emphasized point I wanted to make. We want more intelligence, and yet it brings about all sorts of problems that I don't know how we're going to solve. One of these problems is, what happens when you effectively automate away a significant proportion of the population's work? What happens when all the truck drivers become redundant? What happens when almost all menial manual labor becomes automated away? On one level, we want that. On one level, that's exactly what we want. And you can imagine scenarios like the introduction of the cotton gin. Well, what did the cotton gin do? Well, it created a much more efficient, effective way to harvest cotton. All the workers hated it because they were out of a job, or so they thought. And this happens all the time with any innovation, where you have something that destroys in a previous industry, and yet in the ashes of that destruction, resources are used more efficiently and labor is allocated more productively into different fields. And this is the history of human improvement to a certain extent, is old technologies become redundant, people lose their jobs, and then they end up in different areas with more productivity in terms of their labor. But this is a very painful process, and you end up in scenarios where some of those people are kind of left behind. They're not necessarily able to get a new job. They're not necessarily able to actually adapt to the new scenario. And throughout human history, this hasn't been much of a serious problem because there's always been more room for improvement. There's always been other things these people can do. What happens when there isn't? What happens when we legitimately take away their ability to do work because it's simply more efficient and productive for everyone to have an AI system do it for them? Not everyone can be a scientist. Not everyone can actually be an engineer. It's the hard truth of certain people are wired differently. Certain people have different IQs. Certain people have different levels of intelligence. And not everyone is wired in a way to be a scientist and an engineer. And if your job is repetitive and simple, you're on the chopping block first for what exactly is going to come down the pipelines here. And again, we want this in some sense. We want more intelligence. We want to make life better. We want to be able to allocate labor more efficiently. We want to have people not have to drive trucks and do 12-hour shifts every day. We want them to be able to spend time with their families and do other things. But so much of life's purpose and meaning is derived from the work that we do. Obviously, there are other sources, family, friends, the love you have for them, hobbies. I mean, these are significant sources of meaning, no doubt. But a massive source is what you do. Is a career, is a job. What happens when you can no longer do that job? What are we going to do with the tens of thousands of truck drivers that no longer have a job? And if history tells us anything, is that they will be used more effectively in other areas. But again, what happens when they can't be? What happens when they're actually not capable of doing anything productive in the economy because we've automated away so much of the work, and only a minority of people even have to work anymore? And this is the main concern of someone like Andrew Yang, Yang Gang, shout out. And he was a 2020 presidential candidate. And he talked about this is a serious problem coming down the pipelines. And his solution was something called UBI, which is Universal Basic Income, which essentially was that we're going to get so wealthy and rich that even though certain people can't work, we'll be able to easily allocate enough resources, given the increased efficiency in automating where their jobs, we'll be able to allocate plenty of resources to them so that they can get by and be perfectly fine. And again, that doesn't seem like a horrible solution. You run into a problem of meaning. You run into a problem of purpose. What are these people going to do instead? So much of our lives are spent working towards a goal, economically speaking. And it's not entirely clear what happens when you take away that piece of someone's life. So there's some serious questions here about what this does to the human condition and what this does to the way in which we think and interact with other people. And this brings me to one of my final points here, which is Aldous Huxley wrote A Brave New World, and the basic gist of the novel is that it's a dystopian novel, and yet in some sense it's a weird dystopian novel because it's kind of a dystopian utopian future, if that makes sense. It's about a society that's doing incredibly well economically. They've genetically engineered out essentially all of the major illnesses, all of the major ways that people die. People live long, happy lives. And yet, there's something off about this world. And I want to read a description of the main points of the book. And I want anyone that's listening to, the three people that are, to consider how accurately you think these main points describe our current world, and then also how accurately you think they may describe our world in 50 years. So that's the real question here. And the other irony, of course, is that I actually had Chat GPT derive these main points, and as far as I can tell, they're spot on. And it did in about 1 second. So here we go. Brave New World, Aldous Huxley. Point number 1, scientific and technological advancements. The society in the novel is highly advanced with widespread use of technology, genetic engineering, and psychopharmacology. Emphasis on psychopharmacology. Social control. The government in the novel uses a combination of psychological manipulation and technology to control the population and maintain social stability. Loss of individual freedom. The people in the society are conditioned from birth to conform to the values and norms of the government, leading to the loss of individuality and free will. Consumerism. The society is characterized by a focus on pleasure, entertainment, and material wealth, with people being encouraged to consume and enjoy life to the fullest. And the primary way in which they do this is through essentially a happy drug. It's called Soma. Nice dose of effectively a cocaine-like or amphetamine-like response. So if you're ever feeling down or iffy, just hit up a nice psychoactive drug to make you feel better. So I'm not convinced that those descriptions in some way didn't represent the current world we live in. And I'm also not convinced, in fact, I think it's likely that a lot of those might in fact represent the world that we could live in 50 years if we don't take this problem seriously. And we go into all sorts of interesting questions here with UBI, with Aldous Huxley's book about the human condition and how exactly we're wired as humans. And what exactly brings us meaning in life? What exactly is the point of being here and doing what we do? If we automate away all the work, is that a net good or a net negative when you have nothing to do? Is there a point, as Lex Friedman pointed out, is there a point at which you actually don't want more improvement? Because then maybe you're living a life that isn't actually human. Maybe you're living a life that takes out the necessary struggle of human existence that brings it its validity and meaning. And questions about the future of AI open that door to questioning. And the thing that we want more of, this intelligent thing, we want more prosperity, we want more economic prosperity and progress. And yet, could we enter into a world where it's a dystopian utopia? Could we enter into a world like Brave New World, where so much of the necessary struggle and suffering of human existence is taken out of the world? And I'm not convinced that that's 100% a good thing. When do you hit that point? When do you hit a point where it's like, maybe we should stop improving? And it's an open question. I'm not saying I have an answer to this. I'm just here to ask these questions because I think we all need to ask these questions. And these are conversations that, frankly, we should have had yesterday, but we're going to have to start having more of now. And there's another quote from Brave New World that I think is relevant here. A really efficient totalitarian state would be one in which the all-powerful executive of political bosses and their army of managers control a population of slaves who do not have to be coerced because they love their servitude. Could we enter into a world where that's the case? I mean, certainly the CCP is trying to go there as fast as they can, the Chinese Communist Party. China already has facial recognition and of basically every citizen in their major cities. Everywhere there's a camera. Everything that person says and does in some way is being logged by the government. If you happen to say the wrong thing about Xi Jinping, or if you happen to hold the wrong political belief, or if you happen to, God forbid, criticize the government, you might not be able to get a loan. You may find that your house has been taken from you, or you just may be jailed. With the great power comes great responsibility, and it's not clear how this power is going to be used, even by people that we think are hypothetically moral. And back to Aldous Huxley. It's not clear when the utopia we're trying to make becomes a dystopia. It's not exactly a clear line. Another quote that I think I want to end with is a quote from Dostoevsky, which has a comical element, which is necessary, but also is extremely relevant here about questions about the future and what exactly we want it to look like. So here I go. Shower on him every blessing, drown him in a sea of happiness, give him economic prosperity such that he should have nothing else to do but sleep, eat cakes, and busy himself with the continuation of the species. And even then, out of sheer ingratitude, sheer spite, man would play you some nasty trick. And I think Dostoevsky has a point here. Is all we want to be just showered in rose petals at every waking moment? Is that how we interact with people? Do you want your friend to simply tell you how good you are every day, all the time? You know it's not true. You know that there's an element of you that can actually be changed and improved. And you get annoyed if there's nothing but positive feedback from someone, because you know that you could be better than who you are in a genuine, in a good way, that there's room for improvement, that there's something worthwhile to do to grapple with reality in a serious way and contend with it and come out successful. That's where we find so much of our meaning, from that struggle, from actually pursuing difficult things. What happens when you live in a society where the opportunity to pursue difficult things no longer exists? Well, that's what Huxley was worried about. And that's what the Dostoevsky quote brings to bear. So, there's a lot of questions about what's going to happen with this AI, where we're going to be at. All of these questions about deep fakes, self-driving cars, the human condition and how exactly we're wired as creatures, programming morality into these systems, where it goes. These are all questions we need to ask ourselves, and these are all questions that we should be concerned about right now. And that's the point of this particular episode of this podcast, is we need to think about this now, because there are some serious things coming down the pipeline, and we do not know how to handle them. Thank you for listening.